Welcome back. Last time we talked about...
Oui,
Okay, I talked about two figures from the American Renaissance, Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville. Today, I'll cover three people from that era, Alexis de Tocqueville, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Henry David Thoreau. And you're welcome to jump in at any time.
hey, you said two people last time.
Ah, you were paying attention. The last two are writers we cover in the seminar, but the first fellow is important for explaining the nature of American society during the American Renaissance and the era leading up to it. But first off, look at these pictures of the first 7 presidents and tell me what you notice about them.
They are all men.
And they're all white.
The first 4 have really awkward hair.
Bingo, and the 6th has almost none, but it's the 7th we are most interested in. Now, part of this is the natural evolution of styles and fashion, but the 7th, Andrew Jackson, differs in that he doesn't look as aristocratic as the others. And that is because with his election in 1828, Jackson ushered in the era of the common man in America. Laws were loosened to allow more people to vote, and Jackson ran as a populist, a change from the old elites who had governed the nation. Jackson was the first president not from Massachusetts or Virginia. He was born in a log cabin in the Carolinas and campaigned as an average man. He had been, however, a military leader in the War of 1812 and in battles against Indians in Florida. But poor or wealthy, and he was later wealthy, his presidency reflected a changing mood in America, one that celebrated the common man, and these social changes led to the time being called Jacksonian democracy. It was to this America that a Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, arrived in 1831. An aristocrat, de Tocqueville toured the U.S. for 9 months, ostensibly to investigate American prisons. His real interest, though, was in the state of democracy in the new nation. He sensed that this new form of government was on the rise. There had been more than one revolution already in France, and he wanted to see what the future might look like. In 1835, he published a book called Democracy in America, with his impressions of the country. It is as perceptive a book about the U.S. as has ever been written. Outsiders can often see what the others on the inside can't. He noted that equality in the U.S., both in public and private life, was stronger than in Europe. There was equality between the sexes, but no attempt to make them be the same. The roles of men and women were much more distinct in the New World than the Old. There was little respect for social rankings and elites. Estates were broken up and not inherited, so that wealth was not passed on like in Europe. Instead, people had to fight to gain wealth. The poor were driven to gain wealth, and the rich could easily lose it. Thus, he found that Americans had a very strong love of money. He also believed that the issue of slavery was one the U.S. would have to deal with, given its supposed commitment to equality. He noted that newspapers and the many different opinions they represented created an atmosphere of chaos in the country, but on the whole, this was a healthy thing. He found that religion was much stronger in life in the U.S. than in Europe, and this too was good because it balanced their materialistic tendencies. And he saw them as passionate joiners of clubs and associations. Was all of this positive? Yes and no. They joined associations because at heart there was a great loneliness in a society without older social institutions. They valued money so that they could measure themselves against their neighbors. Equality seemed like a good thing, but people still wanted to compare themselves to others, which they couldn't in a society without strong social classes. So they used money instead. Without a way of measuring talent, what remained was a broad sea of sameness choosing its leaders. Thus, equality in a democratic society led to mediocre people being in charge, and mediocrity in society as a whole. In society, like in politics, the minority had to simply accept the will of the majority. Majority rule in government led to a tyranny of the majority in all forms of thought. In short, equality led to conformity. This then identifies one of the problems of this era. The conditions for individualism were there, but the self-reliant individual was hard to find. A broad, open democratic society produced not individualism, but conformity. It was the beginning of a mass society. And into this picture stepped Ralph Waldo Emerson, a Unitarian minister from the Boston area who left the church in 1831 at the age of 29, when he decided he couldn't agree with church doctrine on the miracles of Jesus. He became a writer and lecturer, publishing a series of essays in the next few years that helped establish Transcendentalism as a philosophical movement. In Nature, Emerson laid out the foundations of Transcendentalism. They believed in the unity of all creation, and that God was inside each and every one of us. It is no surprise, then, that Transcendentalists also believed that man was inherently good and only had to listen to his inner voice to find God. Knowing oneself and nature would lead to revelation. Society, they thought, corrupted mankind, and one needed to follow one's own intuition rather than logic. If that last sentence sounds familiar to you, then you understand that Transcendentalism also represents America's version of Romanticism. A year after he published Nature, Emerson gave a speech at Harvard University entitled The American Scholar, referred to by many who heard it as an intellectual declaration of independence. In it, he compared man thinking versus the bookworm, and criticized those who worship the book rather than think for themselves. He asked the question, what are the purposes of books? And his answer placed books after the act of thinking for oneself.
So that means I don't have to read anything?
No, not quite. Exposing yourself to other ideas is always good. Plus, you do want to pass the exam, don't you? Anyway, Emerson's claim that we have listened too long to the courtly muses of Europe solved the problem of the old era and ushered in the new era of the American Renaissance. No longer did America have to worry about having no history. Tradition was unimportant because consistency was no longer a virtue. Each person and each generation discovered the world anew. It worked on both a personal and national level as well. Probably Emerson's most influential disciple was Henry David Thoreau, a man 14 years younger than Emerson, who had also gone to Harvard. He was from the town of Concord, to which Emerson had moved, and became a tutor to his children and handyman at Emerson's home. In 1845, Thoreau asked Emerson to let him build a cabin on land Emerson owned at Walden Pond, just outside Concord. Here he began a 2-year experiment in self-reliance, vowing to practice what Emerson preached. It was during this time that Thoreau was arrested and put in jail for refusing to pay taxes. He objected to the U.S. government's tacit support of slavery and explicit support of a war against Mexico, one which he saw as an unjust imperialist adventure. The single night he spent in Concord jail led to a simple revelation that later both Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King took as inspiration. The state proves itself weak when it believes it can control a person's body, but not his will. Thoreau was disappointed when someone paid the tax for him, and the next morning he left the jail to return to the cabin near Walden Pond. For him, the only place for a just man in an unjust society was in jail.
Amen, brother. Lock my ass up.
That can be arranged. Anyway, he ended his stay at the cabin after 2 years, and in 1854 published a book, Walden, detailing his experience. Thoreau was not an easy person to get along with, as the opening lines of Walden attest, and waking up people was what he was all about. He embarked on his experiment to better understand his life and himself, and the idea of withdrawing from society and being self-reliant is one that has captured the imagination of many Americans to this day. His logic is often seemingly paradoxical, but that is done mostly to challenge people to think.
Hey, not acquiring goods? That sounds downright un-American.
You're darn right it is. He's subversive in many ways, but Walden is full of excellent quotes like these. They are very much in keeping with Emerson's call to reject tradition and the old ways. Only new thinking moves one forward. And some very much reflect de Tocqueville's ideas about the loneliness in mass society, when everyone has only their neighbor to compare themselves to.
My neighbor?
But that's enough food for thought for now. Just remember that Thoreau is thought of today as a naturalist, a pacifist, a vegetarian, and an individualist.
Wow, a real hippie.
Next time, we'll finish up with the American Renaissance. See you then.